Welcome to the Aerospace Ambition podcast. We are Kieran and Marius, and we are going to introduce you to the fascinating world of aviation, climate, and AI. I'm Marius, an aerospace engineer from Munich with a deep passion for sustainability. Kieran is a PhD researcher from the University of Bristol, exploring the science behind aircraft emissions and investigating ways to drastically reduce aviation's impact on the environment. We have met at a conference this summer, which Kieran organized, called Aviation Climate Impact Mitigation by 2030. After this conference, Kieran and I worked together on a paper and discovered our common passion for sustainable aviation, which is why we decided to continue our journey through this podcast. So Kieran, who is our guest today?
So our guest today is Finlay Asher. He's a Scottish mechanical engineer with extensive aerospace experience, designing future engine concepts at Rolls-Royce for various Airbus and Boeing aircraft. In mid-2020, he quit his job to focus on climate action and now campaigns for a rapid worker-led transition of the aviation sector. He has a social media channel called Green Sky Thinking, and he's passionate about deconstructing complex climate topics to make them accessible to a wider audience.
So hi and welcome, Finlay.
Hey to both of you.
So Finlay, I mentioned the conference which Kieran organized, and this is where I first saw you. So you kicked off the conference with a presentation, and I think it was brilliant to set the scene for that day, where the scientists then contributed recent findings, etc. And so that's the point when I reached out to you, and we had a subsequent discussion afterwards, which I really enjoyed and I learned a lot. And so for the rest of our listeners now, maybe you can briefly set the scene. What is the Safe Landing NGO? What are your goals? And especially, what does a day look like in your life?
Yeah, so I met Kieran actually at a Royal Aeronautical Society conference a year or so ago. And I was just going to go along to that conference as an observer. But Kieran had David Lee lined up to speak, who's a prominent climate scientist on aviation contrails, and he kind of pulled out quite close to the time, and I was brought in as a backup person to start the conference, which was good exposure for me. Hopefully, I did a good job. And yeah, as you say, I'm a mechanical engineer. I worked as an aerospace engineer at Rolls-Royce for about 8 years. I was designing aircraft engines, and I quit my job a few years ago now because I find that I was very passionate about sustainability. I was trying to push the dial within my company, within Rolls-Royce, around their sustainability strategy, around what they were saying in the media, around how our industry lobbied government, and also just because I thought the product strategy of the company was actually quite dangerous when I considered how I think the market will change over the next 10, 20 years. But I realized that kind of running this internal employee sustainability group that I was running within the company, I realized that this was the most interesting thing to me. I was focusing on like a vibration issue in one of our engines in service, quite a complicated job, quite stressful. And I was doing this other thing on the side. And I thought, you know what, I think I'm 30, I don't have lots to tie me down. And actually, I'd like to try environmental campaigning. I took voluntary severance during COVID. I went to live with my mum. I started making some YouTube videos explaining some of the issues behind aviation technology when it comes to decarbonisation. And then I met a bunch of other aviation workers that also worked in the aviation sector. Many of them were pilot, and they were very concerned about the impact of flying. And actually, I realized there's quite a lot of us out there. When you go and talk to people in the sector, a lot of people are concerned about climate change. They're concerned about aviation's impact, and they don't think the industry is doing enough. A lot of people are uncomfortable about some of the positions and the lobbying and the greenwash from the sector. They want to do something, but they don't know how. So Safe Landing is a group, it's an umbrella group for anybody in the aviation sector. We started it kind of on a voluntary basis. It was running for a year or so, and then we managed to get funding for us to continue to run it full time. So this is my job for the time being. And it's bringing workers, like really anybody connected to the aviation sector that thinks that we should be pushing our sector to do more from within and to take action. And that can be in a number of different directions. And we're there to support and facilitate aviation workers to do that.
Brilliant. And a typical day, what does it look like?
Yeah, so typical day is either, so we we kind of have different strands to our work, right? One of them is putting an alternative narrative out there, which is the aviation workers are really concerned about the direction of the industry. And we don't think that the strategy of the industry is sound. We think it's really dangerous. We think that we can't rely on technology. We also need to look at behavior change. We need to look at flying less, or at least limiting how much we're flying, which is a taboo subject amongst aviation professionals. And we actually think that ignoring this is really dangerous to workers and dangerous to jobs. So a big thing about what we do is we put content out there to social media, on our website. We try to get into the media to have that conversation. The other thing we do is we go to industry events, and also we go to trade union events, so and political stuff as well. So we do a lot of outreach, and yeah, so I work with different environmental organizations that are pushing for cleaner transport. We bring quite an interesting perspective to them, because often environmental campaigners that are pushing for change in the aviation industry have never worked in it. So we have quite a unique insight that can help develop policies, develop campaigns. Also, we do bring like quite a unique narrative, because often in the media, whenever there's a climate protest or there's a bit of climate policy being discussed, there's often this framing of kind of environmental campaigners on one side, industry and workers on the other. We think that actually rapid climate action is good for workers, and so we bring that as well. The other thing we do is we do technical stuff ourselves. We respond to government consultations, airport expansion consultations, etc. We've got involved with legal campaigns around airport expansion and around greenwash. And then final thing we do is we push for workers to be more informed. So that can be as simple as we put on talks on, hydrogen aircraft or carbon offsetting or something like that. So workers can understand the reality behind the stuff, but also the work that we do with trade unions, we know if we go in and we try and convince trade unions of our opinion, that's going to be difficult without having an informed discussion that's evidence-based and getting trade unions and workers to arrive at the same position as us through like conversation, dialogue, and learning from experts. So a big thing that we're pushing for is worker assemblies, which are using deliberative democracy. So a big thing that I've been doing this year and spending a lot of my time on is pushing for a deliberative workshop for aviation workers to consider the future of air travel. And we ran a kind of first of its kind workshop in Bristol last month. So a lot of planning went into that. And at the moment, I'm looking at the output report and putting together the videos and stuff.
Great. Thanks for that, Finlay. So I think what we'd like to know is, okay, we'll get onto the actual solutions and the problems that we have at play in the aviation industry soon. But do you have a particular decisive moment that led you from going down the aerospace route to becoming an environmental campaigner? Was there like a sudden, did it suddenly flip a switch and you just, was there something that really brought that on?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing to say is I've always thought that climate change is like the biggest issue of our generation, and it's why I got into engineering. I mean, my dad was a civil engineer, so probably that had an influence. But I decided to do mechanical because I thought moving things were more interesting. And really, I thought, well, I could go work on wind turbines, right? And that could help the climate crisis. It turned out that when I was looking for jobs at the end of my university, I applied to lots of renewable energy companies and didn't hear back. Whereas Rolls-Royce gave me this job offer, and then they gave me a really good offer to come back on the leadership scheme of the as a graduate. But I always had this concern I always knew I was not under any illusions that aircraft produce a lot of pollution and are very carbon intensive. What I just thought, I guess how I justified it, was that I thought if I go and work on the cutting edge technology to make aircraft and aircraft engines more efficient, that will be doing a good thing. Because if I can get that 10% efficiency improvement, 10% of a very carbon intensive activity is a lot of emissions saved, and that'll be beneficial. What happened though was that as I was working in future programs on the aircraft and engines of the future, I began to realize that, and I was creating the technology development plans and stuff, is that it became clear, firstly, we didn't have time. Secondly, that we needed to be working on this stuff rapidly and putting lots of resources. We weren't. And that none of the policies were in place to push us to do that. And then a few things happened. I mean, I got quite involved in internal activism in my company, actually around defense before I got involved in climate. The Yemen conflict happened, and there was a lot of potential war crimes happening. Some of our customers were involved, and I was pushing from a human rights perspective to the CEO to update how we monitor the use of our products by our customers when it comes to defense and the military engines Rolls-Royce produce. And the next thing that happened is actually my dad died. And my dad was a very ethical person. And I know as he ran his own company and he didn't do particular jobs around defense. And we always had this kind of conversation around both climate and defense. And he had this opinion, if you work at a big company, they're kind of faceless. Nobody kind of takes accountability. Everything's done for shareholders. And if you want to like do something better, you need to like work at a smaller company where that dynamic doesn't exist. And I always said, no, but I think being at a company, like being at one of these companies and having good people inside means that they can challenge and hold them to account. And look, I'm having this conversation with the CEO. Look, I'm pushing the chief technology officer. I've made them have to discuss this topic. I've asked them difficult questions. I would struggle to do that if I was outside, if I was Greenpeace or whatever. They could never get the time. Now, obviously, after he died, I did reconsider that, and I thought, yeah, I actually want to up my activism, and I did that. The other thing that happened was Extinction Rebellion in 2019, big protests in London. Greta Thunberg talking about flying less and sailing across the Atlantic. This caused the aviation industry to really up their public relations campaigns around climate and around what they were doing to improve the environmental impact of their product. And I thought that this was very misleading. It really troubled me. And that led me to set up a lunchtime talk called Rolls-Royce and Climate Change. And it was about how our impact is actually very high. A lot of the technology, I don't think will be ready in time. And I think we need a bunch of policies, but we're actively lobbying against a company. And I thought that was really dangerous to workers. So off the back of that talk, I got together this group of people that were keen on that as well. And then it kind of went from there. I got more and more activated on it, and I decided, I'm going to take the step and leave and try and do this myself outside.
Thanks for sharing that, Finlay, because this is something I did not know before, and it's something that shows just crazy motivation and really intrinsic motivation. And this leads to another question that I asked myself beforehand. So I don't know, when you're working in the industry or you're launching a product, then at some point, you're releasing the product and you can clearly see this is my result, so you can put a check mark there. However, what you're doing is kind of a moonshot in a way, so you have to face a lot of resistance, and it's a very long-term kind of a process because the goals that you set are really ambitious and really high. So how do you manage to stay motivated on a day-to-day basis, given the long-term nature of your quest?
I think so. The first thing is when you're doing climate campaigning, it can be difficult. It can feel like you're making no progress, and like a rational observation of the situation is that you've got opposition that have a lot of resource, the fossil fuel industry and a lot of other industry, automotive, aviation, that have billions upon billions of pounds and dollars and euros behind them. And they've got massive amounts of people working for them. They've got big public relations teams and marketing teams, sustainability teams that are overwhelming the internet and the airwaves with the opposite information to what we're trying to get across. And we've got a very small budget, small team of people, and we're trying to get an opposite message out there. And it does feel like David and Goliath, right? And that can be paralyzing for a lot of people. I think I've always appreciated an underdog fight, and kind of I always say to people as well, like I think it's very interesting, right? Like if you go to watch a film and someone says, "What's the film about?" and you say, "Oh, it's about somebody that had a really easy task to do. All of the odds were stacked in their favor. They got up one day and they did it, and it went perfectly." You say, "Well, that's not really a film I want to watch." If you say, well, there was there was an army of 300 Spartans and they had to fight 10,000 Persians, and they had a lot less resource, and like there was no way they were going to do it, and then they tried, and you know what, maybe even they failed. Like that's still interesting. And I suppose I want what I want to be led by my principles, and I want to like give it a shot, even if you fail. And I want to look back at my life and think, don't have regrets. I tried, even though something seemed impossible. I gave it my best shot, and I did what I felt I should do with my conscience. So that motivates me. And yeah, that's kind of what gets me up every morning and keeps me doing some of this stuff that can be difficult.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty inspiring, to be honest. Like, this is nothing to do with aviation. This is basically a lesson for life, right?
Yeah, well, I think the 300 analogy definitely rings true. I definitely feel that a lot as well. In my research career, it's just like it just feels like you're fighting a losing battle a lot of the time, and in a lot of ways, we might be, but there's no point in giving in. We need to double down. We need to just keep going on this path, because it is a very exciting and pivotal time to be alive. And if we squander our chances, then what's the point of that? We might as well do what we can with the time we have. We've been born into this world at the time which is potentially the most pivotal time in human history. So it's up to us. It's our duty to actually engage in climate activism and to push this forward, so that you've got to just keep it ticking over, really, to the point where we reach a tipping point, and hopefully a social tipping point, which means that we eventually cross over into a realm in which a lot of social change happens very, very quickly, and only then will we know that we've won, or that we've actually been successful in our pursuit. So I guess that kind of brings me on to the next point of like, what are the highlights, and what are the things that you're most proud of so far throughout your career as an engineer, but also an aviation climate campaigner? Like, are there any milestones that you really look back on and you think that that's what keeps you going as well?
Yeah, well, there's definitely been like some standout highlights of the past few years. One of them, and this is a good example of something where you try and you fail, but I got one of the first things I did in the first year of after I quit my job. I put a bunch of videos out there on YouTube channel. Like, those weren't particularly successful. I've not got millions of views, but what happened is a lot of community groups saw those videos, and it really helped them unpick some of the greenwash that was coming from the aviation industry. And that was quite a difficult thing for them to deal with, because it was all about technology. And if you've got a community group that is trying to resist the expansion of an airport, and they're being told hydrogen aircraft are going to fix everything, or biofuels or something, having a 3-minute video that explains, hopefully in layman's terms, in a simple way, why that's not the case was quite valuable. And what that then did is it gave me links to these groups. And there was one in Bristol in particular, where there was a very energized public campaign against the airport expansion there. And they did a lot of fundraising. They managed to challenge the airport on legal grounds. They firstly got the application rejected by the council by putting on pressure to councillors. The airport then appealed that and said, you know what, local councillors shouldn't be able to block an airport expansion. It's a matter for government. And it went to this public inquiry, and they raised money again, and they got a good, really good barrister, and they got a climate scientist, and they also hired me. So this is one of the first paid bits of work. Again, just to give you a scale, I got about £1,000 for doing this, and it took 3 months. So wow. Quite a cut in salary compared to being an aerospace engineer. But the point is, like, I produced this report, right? And I went and I gave evidence in the inquiry in person with the barrister. I was cross-examined by the barrister of the airport that also represents Heathrow and Stansted. He was a bit, when you say like kind of devil's advocate, definitely feel like that was him. And I feel like I gave a really good representation, and we made it very obvious that the airport was really deceiving people with its plan. Now, they won on a technicality, which is basically to say, like basically none of my evidence really mattered, because the airport successfully argued it was not a matter for local planning, it was a matter for national government. And even though the national government doesn't have a good strategy for aviation, it isn't doing a cumulative assessment of aviation emissions, they aren't telling different airports to expand, they're leaving it up to local communities. So there's this black hole that allows all airport expansions in the UK to happen. So we lost that case, and it was appealed, and we still lost. But that was an incredible kind of moment for me, because I was actually like putting myself out there, and we gave it a big fight. And that team they had Client Earth, who are a big legal charity that fighting environmental action on lots of fronts using the law. And also Kevin Anderson, who's like actually a hero of mine. If you want to know about carbon budgets and how much time we've got and what climate action actually looks like, check out Kevin Anderson. And I got to stay in a hotel with him for a week and have dinner with him every night and strategize on the case. And it was like lots of fun. So that was probably one of my highlights.
Yeah.
I've also I've been on Scottish TV debating the CEO of Loganair, who are the biggest domestic airline in the UK, ahead of COP26 in Glasgow. I think the deliberative workshop we ran in November, this was an idea that I'm not going to say I came up with it, like citizens' assemblies exist as a thing. But what we did that was novel is we said, well, the future of industries in different sectors, we should be including workers that actually work in those high carbon sectors in the process of deciding what does the future of that industry look like. And that's something that's never been done before. It's something that an idea that we came up with. We raised money to do this in the aviation sector. We pushed different trade unions on trying to do it this year and didn't quite get agreement for them. So we went ahead and we did our own thing to demonstrate this is possible. So that was quite a proud moment as well, just seeing that actually kind of come to life with a bunch of aviation workers from across the industry all showing up at the Aerospace Museum and having that conversation together as well.
Wow. That's very impressive. And now I can tell how you keep up your motivation, because there are some achievements that keep you rolling, right? I mean, this is something maybe sometimes that's not clearly visible. I don't know, when you're on LinkedIn or something, but I think it's very healthy to take your motivation out of those points. So I find that very inspiring while you're on such a moonshotty kind of mission, right? And maybe going from past achievements to a future achievement. So I think there's a lot of value in like first principle thinking and not overcomplicating things too much, but really looking at, okay, what are we looking at? It's very simple. Aircraft fly and they emit something on the way. And so naturally, one of the first thoughts would be, what role does demand play in this situation, right? And I'm really glad that we are living in a world where there's this invisible hand that is controlling the price, driven by supply and demand. I think there are a lot of benefits to this. Now, the question really is, does this scale with the resources that we have on Earth, on this planet? And this naturally leads to a point that one could say is not really actively tackled by the industry. That is demand management. And maybe for some of our listeners, you could introduce us a little bit to the topic, like what measures are there to somehow control the demand, limit the demand? And what is your favorite one out of these solutions and why?
Yeah, so demand management is a kind of way of saying we need to fly less. And we certainly do need to fly less, although what becomes clear when you look at the data is a small minority of the world need to fly less, and the majority of people can keep on doing what they're doing. So yeah, the first thing to say is that, we've spent a lot of time looking at technology, looking at the fuels, looking at other solutions like offsetting. And we think all of these things are not going to deliver at scale in the time that's required. And the time that's required is the next 10 years. So once you understand that, you see, well, we do need to limit flying, because if we keep on expanding, we will blow our carbon budget very quickly. And there's lots of studies out there. I could show you reference after reference after reference that say this is true and it's inevitable. So that might seem kind of obvious to some people, but to many people that's anathema, and they will not kind of agree with it. But that's very much what, as aviation workers, we think we should speak in an evidence-based way, and we should tell the truth. And we think that definitely we will need to limit how much we fly. So how do we do that? So the first thing is that aviation emissions are caused by burning fuel. The more fuel you burn, the more emissions you produce. So we need to minimize the amount of fuel that aircraft burn as they transport people. And that means minimizing the amount of energy that you use to transport people. So really, we need to focus on fuel use and constraining fuel use. And if you have a certain amount of carbon that you can emit into the atmosphere, that means there's a certain amount of fuel that you can burn. If we want to control that, we just limit how much fuel we sell, and that will limit how much fuel is burned. And that will mean we stick to the budget. So fundamentally, saying first principles, we need a carbon budget that says this is the amount of greenhouse gas put into the atmosphere each year. That amount needs to be decreasing every year towards zero. If you look at the charts from the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, the International Energy Agency, etc., you see we'll run out of our carbon budget in the next 10 years. And really, we kind of need to be tapering towards zero emissions by mid 2030s at this point, if we're to stay below 0.5 degrees. Probably even in that case, we'll go over 1.5 degrees. So a realistic plan needs to have a carbon budget where the carbon budget reduces every year towards zero in the mid 2030s. And that will mean limiting how much fuel we use. Now, once you have that framing in place, you then have political decisions to make about how you use that fuel and carbon budget, and whether you use that equitably, i.e. you spread flying across the population, or whether you do it kind of how you do it right now, which is very inequitably. The majority of emissions are produced by a tiny people. So a really good example of this is if you just look at commercial airlines, they make a lot of their money from premium seats, first class seats, business class, etc. And those seats are bigger, they take up more space on the aircraft, and they produce more emissions per passenger mile. If you had a certain carbon budget, you got a certain amount of fuel, a certain number of flights you can do, one immediate thing you can do with no technology whatsoever is change the seating configuration in your aircraft. If you make them all economy, then you'll minimize fuel burn per passenger because you've got more passengers in there. The same with increasing the capacity of your aircraft so that every seat is filled with a passenger as well, improves things. So that's something that to be remembered, is that we can literally change that. Now, airlines don't want to do that because frequent flyers and first class, premium economy, etc., they generate higher margins for their business, and that means that their aircraft are actually tailored towards trying to maximize those seats, which is like a perverse environmental incentive. So
I guess
if you think about policies
I was just going to say, I guess it's kind of the same situation with private jets, and the
so
private flying
jet
industry is it's driven by the same margins and under the same premise of you focus on the luxury travel, which brings in the money, but it's catastrophically bad for the environment.
Exactly. So like a private jet is then even worse, right? And the reason why a private jet is worse is because it scores badly on kind of every metric. Like, firstly, there's usually only a handful of people inside the aircraft. Next, it often flies quite a short flight. So aircraft are really efficient in cruise. They often do a flight that's 1 or 2 hours, so they spend a lot of time in takeoff and landing and not at cruise. Next, they're often designed to fly faster, closer to the speed of sound, which burns more fuel, getting somebody to the same place just slightly quicker. So they're like the opposite of what you want to do. You want to ideally use aircraft where they're at cruise for the maximum amount of time. You ideally will fly slower and design aircraft for a lower Mach number at cruise, which will reduce emissions. And ideally, you pack the aircraft as much as possible with people so that you get the maximum number of passenger flight. So the way that you move towards this, I mean, obviously, you could say, well, let's just ban private jets tomorrow. We could ban frequent flyer programs. We could even just ban first class and business class seats. That's maybe like the and arguably we're in a climate emergency, so the radical action is absolutely necessary. Maybe even banning all aircraft for a time is necessary. But obviously there's intermediate steps in the way. So financial measures, right? You can make these things more expensive and nudge people away from the bigger seats to economy seats. You can tax jet fuel, the emissions a lot higher, the fuel a lot higher. We don't do that. And you could also apply a frequent flyer levy, right? So if you make jet fuel more expensive, you could choose to distribute that additional cost to people that use more jet fuel and fly further. So if you look at the statistics of who flies and who uses most emissions, like 1% of people in the world use 50% of aviation emissions. And often those people fly 5, 10, 15 times a year. The average person doesn't fly at all. even in the UK, which is a country where a lot of people fly, the average person doesn't fly at all. And then some people fly once or twice a year, but those people that do often fly like to Spain or Italy from the UK a couple of 2-3 hours, whereas frequent flyers often tend to fly to the other side of the world, and they do so regularly and have this disproportionate emissions. So at the moment, jet fuel isn't taxed. Frequent flyer programs incentivize this. So they're literally incentivized to do that. Rather than penalized more and more the more they fly. So there's been a lot of citizens' assemblies that have recommended we have a polluter pays principle. The more you pollute, the more you pay. The more you fly in a year, the more you pay. You could do that just with a simple jet fuel tax, but you could also have more progressive policies like a frequent flyer program. What I think that would do is it would change the way that airlines configure themselves. They'd have to fundamentally change their business models, and we'd see an air transport network that slowed down, that became more distributed, was less towards getting the wealthiest people in society around quickly, and more distributed. So more people have access to air transport, but overall fly less. And when they do, they fly slower and it takes a bit longer to get places. Maybe also we go places in multiple hops. So we don't fly nonstop UK to Australia, but stop once or twice along the way, so that we don't carry the fuel the whole way and things like that. All of those things will cause a reduction in fuel burn. But actually, if you think about it, could cause an increase in employment because we might need more aircraft. We fly slower. That's more hours for a pilot and for cabin crew to get passengers to a given destination, but at lower fuel burn and with more employment. So there's plenty actually of upsides for aviation workers in that future with these policies. And there's plenty of downsides if we don't take action and we have to stop flying completely because of climate change.
So how does this apply to like developing countries who obviously they may rely a lot on the growth in aviation to fund their economy and to help their economy grow? So how do you envision demand management in these less wealthy countries, let's say?
So firstly, to say this is like when I have this conversation with the industry, this is something that they raise, right? Is this issue of social justice? And that feels like a really relevant thing to raise. It's that, okay, well, they care about the Maldives and somewhere that requires is relatively low income, requires tourism to support their economy. And that is obviously the case, and you need to be mindful of that. So the first thing is what I said at the start is setting carbon budgets. I mean, the whole problem with climate change is that you've got certain countries that have much higher emissions than others. And we've agreed in the Paris Agreement that we will limit emissions and reduce emissions in an equitable way with common but differentiated responsibility, which means higher income countries with higher per capita emissions and higher emissions individuals, as well as countries, take action fast and have the biggest, deepest cut. So what that tells us is that countries like the US, the UK, China, and a lot of Europe that fly far more than average, we need to limit how much we fly. But actually countries, in Africa and some of the small island countries you mentioned, don't fly that much themselves and can have an increasing budget, but only if reduced. So if you genuinely care about these places, you genuinely want their economy to improve, and for that to improve the lives of those people, the first thing you're going to be concerned about is actually climate change destroying that country because of drought, because of sea level rise, putting the Maldives underwater. And that means we need to have a big focus on emissions. Then if you care about social justice, you'll say, well, in order for the Maldives to continue to fly or maybe fly more, we need to fly less. And that is, I think, the logical conclusion of that conversation is if you genuinely care about social justice, you want to reduce emissions as fast as possible and reduce those from countries like ours, like I'm in the UK, that fly a lot more below average. And interestingly, that's the view of International Transport Workers Federation, who are a big federation of unions covering all transport workers around the world.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So I guess if you're thinking about the idea of sort of reallocating capacity to developing countries, it may be something that sounds nice in practice, but like actually carrying that out and sort of telling the public that, okay, you're from a more wealthy country, so therefore you're not allowed to fly as much as these people from developing countries. So yeah, it's a nice idea on paper, but maybe in practice, then there may be quite a few hurdles to jump through to reach a consensus on that.
It is kind of, but I suppose this is the issue with the climate crisis in general, right? Is this one of the main arguments is whataboutism, where people say, but China's got this emissions, don't need to focus on the UK, we're 1%, China's 20%. You say, okay, but that's because they've got like 100 times more people. And actually our emissions are higher per person, right? So partly it's a misdirection in statistics. If we decreased flying in the UK by 50% and Nigeria increased by 20%, they're still going to fly less than us on average. So then the next thing I think is really fairness, because when we say we need to fly less, it really isn't the average person in the UK. It's the frequent flyers that are really the top 15% and really the top 5%, and particularly the top one. There's a big inequality even in these countries. So people, I think there's actually lots of studies that show people are very supportive of progressive climate policies if they think they're fair. So I think it's about communication of this. And I think if we do communicate it properly, people will understand, support it. The difficulty you've got is you've got a lot of narratives from climate delay perspective that are distorting that and putting like the complete opposite argument out and saying this is completely unfair. It's a matter of social justice that we keep on doing this. So you have to constantly deal with the alternative argument, getting people being in by that as well. So that a big challenge we have is the communication. We have the facts on our side and the evidence base on our side, but it's how we communicate that.
I guess the socio-economic benefits of aviation definitely not something to sort of just gloss over, because you've got this industry is so deeply integrated into our society. So we can't just suddenly say, let's all stop flying tomorrow and save the planet, because it just won't work like that. Like, there's a lot of benefits that we do receive as well. They may be implicit, but it's like they are very much there. And I think that you do have to present that side of the argument as well, just to sort of put across that you acknowledge that. And this proposal of demand management isn't to try and destroy the industry, it's to save the industry in a lot of ways, because
and like you said, right, there's big there is big. The reason why governments like don't tax aviation and subsidize it and give it tax breaks is because of this idea of it encourage economic development. The faster you have transport links, the faster businesses come in and do big money deals and stuff, and it pays itself back. It's like a loss leader. It's like selling bananas cheaper at a supermarket so people come in and buy other things, right? So that's true, and it's true kind of like in the current economic paradigm of economic growth we've had over the past 50 years. But the point is that we stand to lose all of that growth, and we stand to like go into a massive economic decline because of climate change destroying a lot of this stuff and leading to massive economic losses. And if you realize, and this is my prediction, is that we will be experiencing these economic losses more and more and more so, and it will accelerate over the next decade. And we'll be in the 2030s and we'd be thinking, right, we have to be serious about this now. We do need to limit how much we fly. Now, the worst case scenario, if that plays out, is realizing that we've spent the last 10 years not trying to change it and transform it, but just double down on current business as usual aircraft and airports, and realize we've got this massive excess capacity of airports and aircraft, and we can't fly as much anymore, and we can't get a return on that investment. We spent hundreds of billions, if not trillions, on it, and we were expecting to be able to fly in these aircraft for 30 years as normal, and now we realize we can't. And that is what leads to stranded assets, to like a bubble and burst, big economic losses for the aviation industry itself. And then what's going to happen? Job cuts for workers, like during COVID, where they say this was unplanned. Sorry, we just need to get rid of thousands of workers. So this is actually an economic argument, right? And it's about aviation does provide these benefits. So in order to preserve it, we need to moderate what we do now. It's like if you go on a diet, like eating food is good. It does provide you with nutrients, but if you eat too much, you can make yourself unhealthy. So moderation is key. And I think that's true. That's like the message we're trying to get across here.
Yeah. Like you can have these big fancy airports that we're developing and the new runways that we're building. But what good is that if the airport is flooded all year round and the planes are blowing out the sky? Like it just doesn't make sense.
And Australia, Cairns Airport this week. The aircraft was submerged because of flooding. So it's happening now, and it's not exactly going to improve anytime soon. So it's all about, okay, risk mitigation. We need to address the problem, but also how do we adapt to the coming problems? How do we change the way in which we operate the industry?
I think that was very insightful, and we promised in the beginning to propose solutions, and I'm very happy with what we've talked about so far because I saw solutions in there. And
Well, one solution.
whether it's
But yeah, that's
exactly
one of many, that's
one
for
of
sure.
many, exactly. But I mean, even on a more granular level, whether it's like changing the seating, or the frequent flyer levy, or flying slower, I think that there were some things in there, and this leads me to a next point. A solution that some people may call low-hanging fruit. So in all of these projected low-hanging fruit, you couldn't see the air quotes, but there were air quotes. So basically, people see an efficiency in air traffic management generally. So that's something when you look at the projections, towards 2050, there's always this bit where we can, reduce the emissions through smarter routing, etc., a better air traffic management. And now I feel that within the last couple of months, but probably also years, there was another topic called contrail management that now is on the agenda of many people, and it's in the debate, I would say, currently. So there are different kinds of opinions out there on this topic, but I would like to get your view on this. You've been following probably this topic a little bit longer than the mainstream. Since you're an aerospace engineer, you could probably explain this in a great detail, what actually happens when we speak about, well, contrails in general. So I'd like to just start by asking you very briefly to explain to the audience who may not be familiar with contrails and the term contrail management, what is this referring to?
Yeah, so contrails are what you see out of the back of an aircraft. If you see it flying across the sky, sometimes you just see an aircraft, a silvery object in the distance. Often there is a streak of white behind it. And this is caused by the emissions from the aircraft interacting with the water in the atmosphere. So in different areas of the sky, there's different amount of water sitting there, obviously clouds. And when you fly through that with an aircraft, you burn your fuel and water and soot come out of the back of the engine. That can interact with the sky. And if there is a lot of water, if it's very humid and cold, these contrails form. And basically it's like cloud that forms behind the aircraft. Now this interacts with global warming because if you think about the Earth as a sphere, it's getting heated up by the sun during the day. It then moves away into darkness during the night, and that heat is released back into space. Now, during the day, these contrail clouds, they act a bit like hairs on your arm, and they stop sun coming in, and they kind of block some sunlight and give a little bit of cooling. But what happens in the night is they act like a blanket, and they stop that heat radiating back into space, and they keep the heat within the atmosphere. And that has quite a high on the flights where there's contrails at night that are persistent across night in certain regions of the world. That has quite a high overall warming effect. So you've got a bit of cooling during the day and a lot of warming at night. And at the moment, the best estimates are it's quite significant warming. In fact, it's more than the carbon emission of the aircraft, which are obviously significant. Now, the interesting thing is there's been a lot of debate on this and what to do about it the last few years. But really, we've known about it since the 1990s. There was an IPCC report in the 90s that said they thought the warming effect of contrails was 2 to 4 times that of carbon. We've updated estimates the last few years that say it's maybe 3 times the impact, still in the same ballpark. So we've always known this is significant. And what the industry's done, and when I was in the industry, I saw this, is they've always had a focus on saying the science is uncertain, therefore the solutions are uncertain, shouldn't rush into anything. We need to do more research on this. Let's wait for that. And that's been the message to regulators, is don't introduce policies trying to deal with this because we don't understand the impact enough and we don't understand the consequences of doing anything. And that's very much been the status quo, which is very frustrating personally, because this emphasized the uncertainties is a classic fossil fuel tactic, and it's always been the tactic around carbon emissions. And basically the uncertainties in contrails come from the fact that there's a lot of variables. It depends on the aircraft type, the engine type, it depends on the fuel, it depends on the region of the sky that you're in, and then it depends on whether it's night or daytime. And it also depends on what the surface of the Earth below the aircraft is. So if you're flying over the Arctic, that's a white, shiny surface. the sun will bounce off of that, so you don't get much cooling effect or warming effect if you're flying over that. If you're flying over the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, that's a dark, cold of sea, that absorbs a lot of heat and emits a lot of heat, and the contrails have a bigger impact. And then also whether you produce contrails. Now, what I think is there is a lot of uncertainty in this because of those variables, but as engineers and within the aviation sector, we deal with uncertainty on a daily basis. And the way you deal with it is you split it down into the different uncertainties, and you go and look at what you can and can't do, and you come up with practical solutions of working with the uncertainty and of minimize uncertainty. Now, there has not been enough work, I don't think, over the past 20 years looking at this, given the size of the problem, because it's not been taken that seriously. So we've spent 20 years with almost inaction, doing a few studies that are really not reducing the uncertainty, and because there's been no commercial driver for airlines to do this, and now there's an incentive. There's basically still a focus on like government paid research into climate modeling, rather than practical solutions that we could implement on specific flights, not on all flights, but we could look at, there's a high uncertainty. Well, which flights are high risk? If we look back at the last few years, are there certain routes, certain times of day, certain of year that produce warming contrails? So we've got much higher confidence about those. Well, let's just focus on doing those. And then we could ignore the uncertainty of the rest of the world, the rest of the year, the rest of the day. And I think if we did that, we'd be able to find relatively simple things that we could do, flying slightly lower or higher, and we'd be able to reduce this greatly. I also think there's just the wrong onus on this, because I think the onus should be on the commercial airlines and the world of aviation that has a lot of money to solve this. So, and I don't think it should be the kind of government's position of trying to a minute level of detail and accuracy, assess contrails, which is quite difficult. I think what government should do is they should look at contrails in hindsight that were produced and penalize airlines for that. And I think the onus would be on airlines to develop tools to, as efficiently as possible, avoid contrails. And at the moment, we just don't have those policies. So there's not a policy mechanism that penalizes airlines. So there's not the incentive. Even if you're a capitalist and believe in innovation, there needs to be a driver for that. And at the moment, airlines are quite happy sitting on more research needs to be done. So for me, that's how we change this, as we look at how to apply a financial penalty for it and put the emphasis on the airlines with all the money to do it. Final thing is also you can change the fuel. And sustainable aviation fuel looks like it reduces soot, looks like it reduces contrails. There's quite strong evidence for that. We can't scale sustainable aviation fuel quickly in the next few years, but what we could do is we could actually clean up our fossil fuel supply very quickly, very low cost, and that would mean there was less soot produced when burning fossil fuel, and that should also produce less contrails.
Very interesting. And I think you gave a 360-degree overview of this topic on the right flight level here. Now I have to ask, you mentioned, there's always this debate about carrot or stick approach, I've learned. And I think you just referred to the stick when you said,
yes,
we have to look at it in hindsight, and then we have to penalize any creation of contrails, right? What is currently being done? So do you see solutions out there already? Are they tackling the problem from that direction, or are the current solutions rather looking into carrot kind of approaches? What's your take?
Yeah. So just on the carrot versus stick thing in general, if you look at across the board on this, companies always lobby against the stick because more regulations means more admin for them and more costs. It's worth noting that actually a lot of that means more work for workers. So yes, you might have to hire someone to do more air traffic control, to look at the forecast of the weather, all that sort of stuff. More cost for an airline, they don't want that, but that's more work for aviation workers. The next thing is that when you have policies that are penalizing, it might sound like a lot of people find it weird that I push for a jet fuel tax as well as maybe a contrail tax, because that seems like if you regulate an industry more, then price it more, then that's got to be bad for the industry. Now, it's generally like shareholders of companies don't like this because it eats into the profit margin, but most of the time it leads to more work and more jobs. It probably lead to an accelerated trials and testing of new methods for contrails, and equally on like carbon pricing and fuel pricing, it will lead to more radical aircraft getting developed, which is lots of jobs, really interesting jobs for engineers. So I really push back on this kind of concept of it's not got to be carrot and not stick. I think that the stick's completely missing for aviation, and that's the source of the problem. And I think more stick is really good for aviation workers. So yeah, on contrails, as I say, there's at the moment, the only thing is places in Europe where there's recently been announced this process, the MRV, to monitor, report, and verify or validate contrails and like fuel quality. But they're going to spend like the next 3 or 5 years like doing this, just monitoring and not taking action. And I think we should always be thinking about how can we do things faster. So yeah, we can monitor things, but also why not like perform some widespread trials where we change how we fly and we look at that as well. But there isn't any incentive to do that. So I think literally what we'll see is some airlines, and we've seen this already, do some contrail avoidance flights kind of as a publicity thing for marketing to show that they're doing something, pioneers, but they're all kind of lobbying against actual policies that would make them do this on a consistent basis. My main concern, just broadly, right, with contrail credits is that it's the same problem as carbon offsetting, which is that you need a baseline or a counterfactual of something that would have happened if you didn't take action. And that's completely hypothetical. So you have to say, I was going to fly through that area of the sky and produce a contrail, and then I didn't, and therefore I deserve this money. But what happens is, firstly, you might have never been planning to fly through that part of the sky. Once you realize that there was a contrail forming region, you could decide to fly through it. And then you could decide to reroute your flight and make money. So there's quite easy to game the system. And we've seen this with carbon offsets. People saying we were going to cut down this forest and now we're not going to. So we've got credits. We can now go and produce emissions elsewhere. And it's like we should never have been cutting down that forest. And it's this exact same principle with contrails. I think the next problem is that, you're probably going to struggle to reduce your contrails to zero. So let's say you reduce it by 50%, you get credits. Well, you've still got contrails you're generating, which are causing global warming. So you've got carbon that's causing some global warming. You've got 50% of your contrails still also providing warming, yet you've received credits for the bit you've reduced. So there's not a driver to reduce the rest of it. You're just getting rewarded for maybe doing something you should have been doing anyway. So I think that's problematic. I think you remove all of those problems if you charge for all warming contrails that are produced. That way, a company does have a financial incentive to reduce to zero all the way. And if they get there, they then don't have to pay anything, but they don't ever get credits. And it should be the same with carbon. So unless you're sucking carbon, genuinely removing carbon sky, and that's when you should get credit. The good thing I want to stress here, though, is that actually Europe and the US have a big part to play in this, because if you look at where warming contrails are produced, it's actually because of the geography is mostly over North America, the North Atlantic and Europe. And the interesting thing about that is we're obviously the wealthiest, most developed countries that fly the most. So I think there's an onus on us to do the most, move as quickly as possible on contrails. And the good thing about that is that's within our jurisdiction because they're literally our flights. So I think you don't need to wait for every country to agree. I think just if North America, Canada, the US, and Europe and UK agree on something and trials, they can do that a lot quickly and they can have a big impact. So that's the positive here, is we can reduce, if those countries take accountability and do move quickly and do some practical steps, I think we could have big cuts in contrails.
So this is something that you've posted about recently, Finlay, is the concept of aviation propping up global oil demand. I thought that was a really interesting point to cover.
Yeah. So, well, and this is kind of illustrated by there's a leaked report from Saudi Arabia where they deliberately have this strategy of trying to encourage more petrol and diesel cars in Africa and also more airport expansion to lock in fossil fuel demand, right? So oil and gas companies, they look all around the world at ways that they can lock in reliance on their products to ensure that they can continue. And that's why there's a lot of support from the fossil fuel industry behind aviation growth. And actually, you can see their fingerprints all over these sustainability strategies. We talked about me quitting my company. One of the reasons I left it, I felt very uncomfortable about a YouTube video that Shell and Rolls-Royce put out about how they were pioneering the future of air transport, and it was all going to be sustainable aviation fuel. It was going to be available in 500 million tons by 2050, which, if you do the maths, is like insane amount. And yeah, so I think it should be understood in this context. Like, an aircraft is a metal bathtub with wings full of fossil fuel, full of oil. It's very difficult to replace that with anything else. So the more aircraft there are, and the more airports that are purchased and that need to fly to make that, like, once you buy these aircraft and you expand your airport and you spend billions on that, you rely on those aircraft flying non-stop for like 20 plus years to make the profit back. So that's locking in fossil fuel use. And that's why fossil fuel come behind that. So yeah, we've seen the growth of aviation massively increase oil consumption. Obviously, cars and other things have brought that up, but we're going to decarbonize road transport, hopefully, over the next 20 years. We're going to decarbonize our homes and our grid, but aviation, as well as the plastics industry and other things, are seen by the fossil fuel industry as continuing production, continuing oil use.
Yeah.
This is a very interesting point you made, because you mentioned also other modes of transport and also other industries. And this is something you really raised awareness, at least for me, on this topic, that we have to look at solutions in a very holistic way. And, I always draw this image that basically I'm attending a conference or, I don't know, an industry event in one room, and then everyone in that room is proposing certain solutions, right? And they are all talking about certain resources. And then just next door, there's another industry also doing the same kinds of presentations, and they are talking about the same kinds of resources. And eventually, the pie is only that big, and we all need to have our pieces of the pie. So what needs to be done? Like, what kind of analysis needs to be done, or who is actually responsible for taking such a holistic kind of a view?
So yeah, I mean, this is like, in aviation, we do systems thinking, and systems engineering is a critical thing in our training when we start our job. And we're taught to think about all the requirements and all of the different interactions. And then when it comes to the sustainability strategy, we completely ignore that principle. So yeah, you're right. And basically this comes down to resource. Like, we have limited resource on the planet. That's in terms of fossil fuel we can still burn to stay within the carbon budget. And then when you look at alternatives, you've got biomass and you've got renewable electricity. We have limited amounts of these things. Technically, with renewable electricity, we might be able to scale that up in a much more unconstrained manner. But the limits of how quickly we can design and develop these things and actually project manage them and build wind and build solar, we're just limited. If you look at the next 10, 20 years, there's only so much we can build. And there's competition for that resource between a lot of different human activity. So what aviation does in the first instance, it assumes it can have a much larger chunk of the pie of the remaining carbon budget. And that basically, the argument here is aviation is hard to abate, which is saying it's hard to decarbonize, therefore we should be allowed longer. Now, this doesn't actually completely contravenes the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement is not about that. It's about equity, and the more wealthy you are and the more ability you have to decarbonize faster, you should do. Now, aviation can decarbonize very quickly through behavior change, but they're unwilling to consider that. So they say, no, we need to grow, and therefore we're difficult, and therefore we should get a big slice. Now, this ignores the fact that there just isn't the budget available. Like, we haven't got progress in other sectors that is exceeding expectations. In fact, we're behind. So there is no spare budget. And that's the first problem, and that's kind of the immediate problem to deal with. The next thing is these alternative sources of energy. So renewables, I was saying there's constraints on how quickly we can build it. At the moment, wind is 2% of global energy use and solar is 1%. So even with exponential growth, which we have, like, over the next decade, there's only going to be so much renewable energy we have. And we pretty much need all of it to decarbonize our grid and ground transport. So there's not going to be unlimited excess wind and solar to produce green hydrogen, to produce electrofuels. So biomass is actually more constrained than renewables, because basically just a plant, like biomass, usually it's crops, it's very difficult to produce energy with plants. Solar to chemical conversion for a plant is like 1% to 2% of solar energy into stored energy into like corn or palm or soy or something. Then you go burn that in an engine and you and you chuck away 2/3 of your energy as well. So you're left with like a tiny fraction of solar energy becoming useful movement of a vehicle. If you've got a solar panel, that's 20% and getting better. Capture of solar into electricity, you charge a battery in a car, and then you discharge the battery to drive, and you're like 70-80% conversion efficiency. So you use a lot of solar energy there. If you want to try and replace that with biofuels, because of that inefficiency, you end up covering the planet in crops to try and get enough energy. A calculation was done just looking at the UK, looking at how much farmland would be required. We need half the farmland in the UK for existing jet fuel. You forget about growth. So that just shows you it's impossible to do that, basically, without massively competing with agriculture and, importantly, with biodiversity, which is already massively depleted, right? So we need to actually be returning a lot of land to nature, and that's going to be impossible if we continue increasing our biofuels into crops. And actually in the US, they're planning to use still as sustainable aviation fuel. In Europe, we're a bit more progressive. We're saying we're not going to use crops. We will only use waste. But if you think about it, if you think about waste, like if you have a massive farm growing crops and you say, well, we're not going to use the corn, but we are going to use the waste from that. So like the sheath around the corn, the stalks, the straw from the farm, we take that and we turn that into fuel. Firstly, there's just a lot less of it. And next, that is just like a really energetic bit of material. It's like woody, and it doesn't break down easily. It's difficult to turn it into a fuel, and it's more inefficient again. But also we've got competing demands. So we've got fertilizer that we need to create, and we can use that for farms and for growing food. We need to create energy for the grid, and we can use the same biomass to run a power station. We can capture the emissions and get negative emissions. We can't do that on an aircraft. So an aircraft is much more inefficient, and you can't stick carbon capture on the exhaust of an aircraft because it would be too heavy and it take up too much space. You wouldn't be able to take off with all your passengers. So, but yeah, as you say, like the aviation industry doesn't do that analysis. It just looks around the world for all of the waste it could possibly find. It's very optimistic with what it thinks it can collect and process. It's very optimistic, again, that there will be technology available to convert that biomass into fuel without using too much energy, which hasn't been proven. And then it assumes that nobody else will want the same feedstock or input, when in fact there's lots of different. Another one is bioplastics, trying to replace fossil plastic with biomass derived plastic. And there's countless other use cases out there as well. So yeah, lack of systems thinking and kind of ignoring other sectors' needs as well.
Yeah, I think another interesting spin on that is that it's not only low energy efficiency of using crops and using waste, it's also very poor nutrient efficiency. Like you're not really getting anywhere near as much out of these crops as if you were to feed them to a human or to feed them to animals. So I think that's also worth mentioning, is that there's sort of two strands to that. It's yeah,
absolutely.
There's a lot of issues there related to using these biofuels and sustainable fuels. Is that there's not enough of them, and two, then it's not a very good use of a crop. Even
and actually,
at that point,
this is what you've just mentioned. There is something that is again not mentioned by the industry and not discussed. But if you go in, and I had this same thought as you, I saw that there was a researcher looking at turning human waste into fuel. And I went to ask them if this was indeed a good idea. And we got into a discussion, and they were saying, well, actually, there's human sewage. At the moment, we put it into the rivers, and it causes water pollution. You've got animal manure like pigs and chicken and cows, and that also goes into the watercourse, and it's bad for the environment. But it's also quite energetic because they've chewed up all of those to turn it into a fuel. But obviously, what you could do with it as well, and it's the same with food waste that you don't eat in your kitchen. You could just chuck it away, but you could also compost it. That creates fertilizer, and that can be used in farming
again to feed,
to provide nutrients back to plants. And those nutrients are very difficult to get. We go to large, great effort to get nutrients for fertilizer. In fact, the fertilizer industry produces as much emission as the aviation industry. So it's imperative we decarbonize that. And also, fertilizer is very important for humans to exist and survive, right? Like being able to feed ourselves takes priority over transport. So not only is it more efficient, but there's more social benefit, it's better use of resource, and it's better use of nutrients. But that unfortunate truth is, I don't think is addressed anywhere by the aviation law. So
Sure. And I think that probably takes us to maybe the final point. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was like how safety is number one priority. It's paramount in the industry that we prioritize safety. So there's a slight paradox here, because the more climate change is allowed to progress unabatedly, it will generally lead to much less safe flight. Like I was saying earlier, we're going to have massive increases in turbulence. We're going to see extreme weather events affecting the ability for the industry to operate how it currently does. So what can we do as like more of maybe the more environmentally minded in the industry to convince the public and to convince the authoritative bodies that we actually need to not only transition to net zero from an environmental perspective, but also very much from a safety perspective? Is this something that we need to emphasize as campaigners and as interested individuals?
So we find this a really useful framing to use in our narrative when we're trying to get our position across, because safety is meant to be the number one priority of aviation workers, particularly pilots. You're told that if there's something that could be wrong, potential hazard, you do not ignore it, you act on it immediately and you mitigate it. And you also have multiple options for mitigation. And if the first one fails, you have a backup. We're obsessed with things like that in aviation. Redundancy, we've got two engines in case one fails. We've got two pilots. They eat different types of food, so they don't get sick at the same time. On the engine, there's two fuel pumps and oil pumps in case one fails, and all this sort of thing. So there's always a backup. But we don't, with the climate crisis, I would say not everybody, but what I'd say is corporate leaders that are in charge of these big businesses, airlines and aviation companies, are willfully ignoring these risks, which are medium term. They're not long term risks, because they're already happening and the rest, but they will reach, I think, a boiling point over the 2030s. And what the science is ignoring those risks, and then they're banking on some very optimistic assumptions, and they're relying on technology coming through and fuels coming through. And when you look at the evidence, it's highly unlikely these things will happen. So if you had a risk register, like we usually do in AV, and you went through and identified and you looked at the mitigation option, you'd be very worried. You'd have red marks all over your spreadsheet that there was high chance of multiple lines of failure, right? Yeah. And that failure means massive climate breakdown. It means drought. It means sea level rise. It means we lose the Great Barrier Reef, which is maybe one of the reasons you might fly to Australia. If you see the wildfires in Australia killing off all the koalas, if you think about the Maldives, and you might go there to go diving, but the coral reef is destroyed, and actually Maldives is underwater now, so you can't visit it, and everyone's had to leave. Think about Africa and droughts that mean crops fail, people have to mass migrate, and you completely lose cultures and you lose communities in areas of the world that would have been a great place to visit. So, and then you've got flying itself. You've got wildfires around airports. You've got airports going underwater, got increased turbulence, and a variety of things that are literally, and also just when it's hotter, it's harder for aircraft to take off because the air is thinner. When you have a heat wave, sometimes flights have to be cancelled. Sometimes they need to get rid of passengers or cargo so that they can take off from the airport. So all of these things eat into the business models of airlines. Classic example is San Francisco Bay Airport is increasing its seawall around the airport at a cost of more than $1 billion because of rising sea levels and because it's so close to the sea. So you're literally impacting our business models, and will do into the future. We're destroying some of the tourist destinations that the whole point of flying is to visit, and the human cultures that are there as well. And potentially we're going to end up in a situation, I'm being very bleak here, but in 10, 15 years time, we said we need to a massive reduction in flying. And what that means is that the majority of people aren't able to fly. If you can fly, you're very privileged and it'll be very expensive. And that means there's a lot less work for aviation workers, and a lot of us will lose our jobs. even if there's more employed over the next 5 years. That'll just mean there's a bigger bubble, and that'll mean there's a bigger burst. So the problem, I think the fundamental problem we have here is that we have people in charge, both politically and in the business world, that have a tenure that's short term. It's 1 or 2, 3 years until the next election. For a business leader, they've got a quarterly report and a shareholder meeting that they need to show short-term growth for. They're not going to be in that position in 10 years' time. It's very unlikely. There's this big turnover with CEO. So literally the system is incentivizing them to ignore long-term risk and minimize costs in the short term, which prevents them taking the big transformative actions we need. And it won't affect them because they'll make their money over the coming years, and they'll get that election result, etc. But who will be affected is citizens who can no longer fly, who no longer have a livable planet, and workers who no longer have a viable industry. So I think the key takeaway is to recognize that actually the average person and the average aviation worker, I'm 30, 33, but I want to have a career for 30, 40 years. So I'm going to live through these decades. And I have a very different focus from those businesses. I have self-interest in considering the long that they don't have. And therefore, it's imperative on us to put pressure on them and force them to consider long-term risks and give us and mitigate them. And that's the safety approach, right? And that's how we need to push on this.
Yeah, so I think we've definitely covered a nice balance of we started off with the solutions, and now we're we're going very much into the bleakness of it all and all of the problems. But I think at the end of the day, we have laid out the fact that there's myriad solutions to this problem, and we just need to really go down a path which enables us to have these conversations about demand management and not to just shy away from the problem and the potential game-changing solution of that concept, which doesn't have to destroy the industry. I think it's one of those things, a rhetoric which is so often put across, is that as soon as we start to limit flights, that's going to destroy the industry. No, what's going to destroy the industry is climate change. So if we can be proactive about it and start upskilling workers now and enforcing this transition in a smoother way than what is going to what is going to ensue if we just go as business as usual, then we can start to make the changes over the next few years. We can enforce contrail avoidance, we can potentially manage demand, we can change our fuels, and these are all things which we need to start having the conversation about, and we really need to communicate with the outside world, because most people I talk to still, they don't know what a contrail is. They don't know the fact that non-CO2 is responsible for 2/3 of the climate impact of flying. This is definitely not common knowledge. Of course, in the industry, it's becoming more so now. But I think us as researchers and as people involved in the industry, we need to make it a priority to communicate these concepts in a more simplified manner, a less academic manner, because it's not necessarily that easy for a lot of the population to digest. Yet it's very important that we discuss these things and that we basically get a general public consensus on the fact that we do need to change our behavior. We do need to potentially reduce or limit the growth in aviation. I don't think anyone can really argue about the fact that we should probably stop growing as much as we are. So I think it's probably quite a nice place to round off.
Just on that, Kieran, really briefly, we have this phrase that is, what we'd rather see this through early design rather than late disaster. I think a lot of what I've discussed we see as completely inevitable. So the only choice you've got is, do you wait another 10 years before you hit a brick wall and there's nothing you can do about it? Or do you start to move in the right direction now and you get a chance to phase it in gradually? And it'll be less of a rocky ride. What do you want? And so early design rather than late disaster is how we communicate that.
Could there have been a better way to round off this episode? I really don't think so. Kieran, thanks so much for co-hosting this. And Finlay, thanks so much for taking so much of your time to answer our questions. And I think it really helped our listeners to get a fuller picture of what the solutions are that are out there. So this leaves me to invite everyone who listened to follow us, if you haven't done so, on Spotify, iTunes, or Google Podcasts.
Thanks for having me. And I should probably put a shout out for Safe Landing as well, safe-landing.org. So I'm sure there will be some aviation workers listening to this, and we'd be very grateful for you either joining the group or just shoot us an email. That's on our website as well. We'd love to hear from you, some of your opinions on this. And if you'd like to contribute to our group, we'd love to have you. So please check us out.
Amazing. Do that.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.